I'm going to show you how you can unit test your Gadget apps. I'll walk through setting up a unit test framework and then write some sample tests for Gadget Actions, HTTP routes, backend utility files, and I'll finish up with front-end snapshot tests. If you have any questions about unit testing your Gadget apps, we have an entire docs page you can check out. That page also has a link to a public GitHub repo that has the exact project I'm about to build already set up. So you can take a look at the configuration or test files if you're interested. There are also instructions for setting up an integration with GitHub Actions if you want to run these tests automatically as part of a CI pipeline. So without further ado, let's get started building our unit tests. I'm going to start by giving you a quick overview of my existing Gadget app. So I have a posts model, which is used to hold blog post content. In the create action for this post model, I'm actually using a get word count utility file, and I'm just calculating the word count of my blog post before saving the record to the database. So this is a create action I can test, as well as a utility function for get word count that I can test. I also have a get hello HTTP route. This is just the default route we generate for you every time you create a new Gadget app as an example. So I'm going to write a test to make sure that this always returns hello world with a status code of 200. And finally, I have some front-end pages, some routes I can test here. We have index and signed in. Let's check these out in my development environment. So this is the index page. It's pretty simple, not really any dynamic content. I'll be able to manage this with a simple snapshot. If I go ahead and sign in, I'll be redirected to my sign in route. And this page is a little more dynamic because I have some user information, and I've also edited this to include the number of posts. So we're going to have to use some mocking tools in order to unit test this page. So let's get to it. First thing I'm going to do is take my Gadget project files and sync them to my local computer. So Gadget has a CLI tool called FileSync that I can use to do this. At the very bottom of the Gadget editor, there's a FileSync button. I can click it to open this little panel, copy the command, and go over and run it in my terminal. Perfect. So FileSync is running now. I should be able to go ahead and open up VS Code. And this is my project. Wonderful. I've got my Vite config package JSON. If I go into my post create action, I can see I've got my word count working properly. So I seem to have all the files I want, which is great. From here on, I can start to actually set up my unit test framework. So I'm going to leave FileSync running so that all the changes I make in my VS Code on my local machine are synced back to my Gadget web editor. I'm going to just create a new tab and change directory into my project. And Gadget uses Yarn, so I'm going to use Yarn to install dependencies. I'm going to use ViTest or ViTest. I think it's ViTest. I don't know how to say it. I do know that it is a unit test framework. So I'm going to use this as the framework. It's pretty similar to Jest, but it integrates really nicely with Vite. As you might know, Gadget's React front ends are powered by Vite, which is why I'm using ViTest as a framework. It's just a nice integration. You can try using a different unit test framework. Some of the setup steps might be a little different, but feel free to try. I'm also going to use .env to manage environment variables and React test renderer, React test renderer to handle snapshot testing in the front end. Perfect. So my dependencies are installed. I should be able to see them. Package JSON. Yeah, looks like we've added it. There's ViTest there. So I can go ahead and add another script. Just call it test. ViTest. Perfect. So I can actually test to make sure that this is running. I can, yarn test. I don't have any tests written yet, but there we go. So I can see the default include, exclude, watch exclude options when running ViTest, and I get a no test files found error, which is perfect. That means it's running at least. The next thing I'm going to do is make some changes to my Vite config file. So this is one of the nice things about using ViTest is it just reads from your existing Vite config. You don't need to set up a bunch of other files or configurations. I'm just going to go ahead and copy some code from the public repo we have on GitHub. First thing I'm going to do is import a reference to ViTest types. I'm going to set up env or .env. Paste that in here. So this is just going to import .env and modify the config so that it can read from a .env.local file. And then I'm going to add some test config. We're going to go set up files. It's just an array and it's the .env config. I'm also going to add a mock reset true so that the mocks are reset before each test. So that's fantastic. That's all of the configuration changes I need for this current iteration of my unit test, which is fantastic. It's pretty minimal. I can now go ahead and I'm going to add a .ignore file to my project root. So .ignore is like .gitignore, but for FileSync. So anything in this file will not be synced to the Gadget web editor, your web project. So I'm just going to add .env.local to this file, and then I will go ahead and add my .env.local file, and this is where I'm going to toss my environment variable. So let's go ahead and check the web editor now. So I can see that things are indeed syncing. Dependencies are out of date, so I'll just run yarn install. I can see my .ignore file, but I don't see this .env.local because it's part of .ignore, which is great. So things are syncing as expected. So that is fantastic. Let's just flip back here. So let's go ahead and set up our environment variable. So the environment variable I'm going to use will actually be a Gadget API key. And we're going to use this API key to set up an API client that we can use to test our Gadget actions and HTTP routes. If you don't want to test any of your backend actions or HTTP routes, you don't actually need to set up this API client. So if I just want to test, for example, my get word count utility, I can go ahead and do that right now without any additional setup. Same goes for any front-end snapshots. If I'm not relying on the API client at all, if I'm just going to mock it out, which is what I'll do, I can go ahead and write front-end snapshot tests. So I don't need to go through these steps, but I'm going to go through them now just to show you how to do it. So I'm actually going to go back to the web editor. I am going to go to settings and API keys. So I have no API key, so I'm going to go ahead and add one. I'm going to turn off access control so it has unrestricted access to my application. I'm going to do this so that I can use some of the internal API calls like delete many to do cleanup after I run my tests. Be very careful. This is like giving yourself super user access, and it is going to point to your development database. So just as a warning, be careful when using your API keys. You do not want this key to leak to the public, which is why we're using a .env.local file. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the key for my development environment. I'm going to flip back to Gadget. Let's go ahead and give this a name. I think I will call it Gadget Test API Key. And I will paste in my key. Don't worry, this key will be deleted well before I put the video up online. So this key will not be valid. So we're going to use this .env.local and set up an API client. So I'm going to go ahead and just create a test folder at my project root. And inside this, let's go api.js. And so I am just going to copy some code here. So this is like setting up an API client in your front end. I'm just pointing it specifically at the development environment and then passing in the environment variable, which holds my API key to finish authentication for the client. If I look in my front end folder, api.js, it is using the same client package. So it's just going to be an API client that I use for testing. Just want to make sure that my environment variable is indeed named the same. Yes, it is. Perfect. So this will be a client I can use to actually make requests against my Gadget backend actions or HTTP routes. I'm also going to just paste in another line here. I can have multiple clients set up using different API keys with different permissions. If I create an API client without any sort of authentication, it's going to be an unauthenticated client. So I'm going to use this to make sure that unauthenticated users cannot create new blog posts. We'll get there in a second. So this is setting up the API client. Now that I have this set up, I'm ready to just write tests. There's no more setup I need to do. So I'm going to mimic my project structure here in my test file. our test folder. You can set up your tests how you want. If you prefer your tests right next to your code files, that's fine too. So I'm going to go ahead and create a post actions folder, and then I'll create a file, create.test.js. That's great. I am just going to copy paste some code in here because it's a bit easier. So there we go. So I'll walk through this. This is just a sample unit test for a Gadget action. We'll just leave it for now. So in this file, I'm going to go ahead and comment out the before all. I'm going to go ahead and comment out this bottom test. We're going to focus on this middle section. So I'm importing my API client that I just set up from in my test folder. And then I am also using test, expect, and describe from the VTest framework. So the describe is just a batch of tests. So test the post.create action. And then I've got my actual test definition. And all I'm doing is I'm calling my API client, api.post.create. So create a new blog post record. And I'm just expect and running tests on the results. So because I'm calling the API client for my development environment, if I go to my web editor, check my data, and then let's actually yarn test now that we have a test. Whoops, forgot to change the client name. That's a bit of an issue. So let's go in here. This is going to be my package. So this will be my unit test example. That should work a little better. There we go. We can see that our test passed. So that is fantastic. So if I go to my data page for my post model and refresh, you'll see that my test post was actually added to my development Gadget database. So you are actually poking at your development Gadget environment. Because of that, if I go back to create test.js and I uncomment this before all, I can use this api.internal.post delete many function to clean up any posts I created from previous test runs. So this filter parameter, anything that matches, so I'm just testing against the blog post title right now, unit test post. Anytime that this test suite is run, it will clean up any records that match unit test posts for the title, and then it will go and run our test. So it makes sure we're always starting from a clean environment. If I remove this filter altogether, it will delete everything in this current data model. So once again, be careful and make sure you're pointing at your development environment. So let's go ahead and test this out now. If I refresh, you'll see that the ID incremented from 16 to 17. That means the old post was deleted, the new one was created. Now I'm going to go ahead and uncomment this last test here, and then I'll re-add some comments. There we go. So this second test is using our unauthenticated API, and it's actually trying to create a blog post, but is expecting a GTT permission denied error. So if I go to my terminal, I can see that both my tests are passing, so that's great. So unauthenticated users cannot create blog posts. Authenticated users can create blog posts. That's wonderful. Now let's go ahead and test this get word count function. So in posts, I'll just create a utils folder, and I will go get word count.test.js. Because this is a utility file, this is super simple to test. Once again, I'm just going to copy paste code and explain it. So these are extremely simple test cases. I'm simply importing the function from where it exists in my Gadget application. So this is pointing to the actual get word count file in post utils get word count. And I am just running test cases on that function. So remember that the function looks like this. It is just an exported function. So I can just test to make sure hello world is equal to 2. It's a word count of 2, or an empty count gives me a 0. If I check my terminal, get word count, so it is still running. That's fantastic. You'll notice that I'm not rerunning my tests. VTest will just continually watch for code changes and new test files. So that's another nice thing about running locally, is that your unit test runner can just run and you can actually engage in test-driven development if you so desire. So this is a utility function. It's pretty simple. It's like testing utility function in any other test framework. Let's do an HTTP route. So in my test folder, let's go routes, and then I'll create a file. I think it was get hello.test.js. So I have my route up here, get hello. It just returns hello world every time I hit it. So I am going to go ahead and add a test to make sure that this is working properly. We're once again going to use our API client. So I'll just paste code again. So we're importing the test API client, and we're using api.fetch to hit the hello endpoint. And we get the response. We can just check the status, make sure the payload is equal to hello world. It's pretty simple. You can also just use the built-in fetch or Axios or whatever you like to make your HTTP requests. We recommend you do it using the API client because it gets all the baked-in goodies that you get when you use it. So we do recommend using api.fetch if you're testing your routes. Okay, so that is your backend actions, routes, and utility files. Now let's do some snapshot testing in the front end. So I'm just going to go ahead, front end, routes, and we'll start with index.test.jsx. Again, just going to import some code and explain it. So importing the same things from VTest, I've got my React test renderer, and then I'm actually importing my JSX file from my production version. So this is just that component. And nothing special really going on here. I'm using the React test renderer to create a snapshot of the index component. And remember, that's just my default signed out page. And I'm expecting tree to match the snapshot. You'll see it has already run because that process is just running. So I can go in, check my snapshot. This looks right. It's got the spinning React logo. You're now signed out. It's got some signed out area. So everything looks fine to me. This is good. I'm not going to add anything more to this test. Signed in is much more interesting. So you can see from the actual component that we have this use user and use find many hook that we're using to actually fetch data from our back end. And then we're displaying our React front end. So I want a way to be able to mock out these use user hooks as well as the API so that I can test different states on this page. So I'm going to go ahead, signed in.test.jsx, grab some code, paste it in, and perfect. Okay. So same thing, we're importing everything we need from VTest. We've got our React test renderer, and we've got the signed in route, the React component. We're doing a couple more things to set up mocks in this file because we do want to mock out those hooks in particular. So you can see I'm using vi.hosted from VTest, and this just creates a mocks object that I then use when I mock out the actual dependencies. And the important thing to note here is that I am returning a use user and use find many named entity that I then mock out later. And I am using vi.fn, and this allows me to dynamically provide mocks in different tests. So for example, I've got one test here where I am mocking the return value of use find many and returning data. In my second test, I'm mocking my use find many and returning fetching true instead of data. So I'm testing two different states, two different snapshots because I'm using this vi.fn for use find many. So I'm going ahead and creating a mock object, and then I'm mocking out the actual dependency and just feeding it this mocks object. Finally, I am also mocking out the API dependency. I'm just providing nothing. We're not really using it at all. It's just a general mock. I don't even think I need to provide all of this context inside. So the actual tests themselves, as I said before, we're going to our mocks object up here, and we are providing a different return for our use find many. So in this first test, I'm providing a test post, so a single blog post returned. And when I create my signed in snapshot, I should see a num posts of 1. So if I go to my snapshot, it should render the default page, which is perfect. So I go down, I can see Carl Weathers is indeed my default user. I've got my email address, and then I see num posts 1. So that is fantastic. That's exactly what I expect. If I go to my second test, I'm using fetching true. So if I go to my signed in route, you'll notice that we've got this fetching Boolean down here. So instead of a num post, it should just say loading in the snapshot. So let's go dig through, scroll down, and we see loading. So that's perfect. So this is the way I'm testing 2 different states, 2 different front-end states, using my mocks and using Vitest's mocking capabilities. So that is the quick overview of how to set up unit tests for your Gadget app. Let's just go over here. Everything looks great. So I do have 8 unit tests. They are all passing right now. I can quit and stop my unit test runner from running. I can go over to my actual Gadget project. You'll notice that I do have my test folder. So all of these tests were synced, which is great. They are all available. I'm not going to run them in Gadget. I'm only going to run them locally. If you do want to run your unit tests as part of a CI process, I would once again encourage you to check out our documentation or our public GitHub repo with this exact same project setup, because we do have the example of in fact, let's just drag it down here. So here we go. In this example, this is the GitHub repo. We actually do have a .github workflows folder, which has this run test YAML. So this ties in with GitHub Actions, shows you how to set up a basic environment. We're, running Node 18, just like Gadget. We're creating a environment file from an encrypted secret in GitHub, which is just our API key. And then we're just installing dependencies and running tests. So if you do want to run GitHub Actions, this is what it looks like. Every time I make a pull request against main or merge into main, it runs the tests. We do have that sample available for you, as well as some documentation. Until next time, I hope you keep building more and coding less with Gadget.